I'm a 24-year-old guy who works as a freelance graphic designer. After graduating college, I thought I'd be able to jump straight into the real world and start building a life for myself. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out that way. Instead, I ended up moving back in with my parents, a decision that felt temporary at the time but stretched out way longer than I expected. At first, things seemed manageable. My freelance gigs were steady, and I was making decent money. I paid rent to my parents, which they made clear was non-negotiable. Their stance was simple. If I wanted to live under their roof, I needed to contribute financially. It felt fair, and honestly, I didn't mind helping out. For the first 6 months, I was able to keep up with rent while still covering my other expenses. I even managed to put a little money aside. But freelancing is unpredictable, and soon enough, the steady stream of work started to dry up. It wasn't like I wasn't trying. I was sending out proposals, pitching ideas, and applying for new projects every day. But the market had gotten saturated, and there were always tons of other people willing to do the same job for half the price. The decline was slow at first. A couple of clients stopped replying, and a few more projects wrapped up without replacements lined up. I figured it was just a rough patch, something I'd bounce back from. But as the weeks went by, my savings began to dwindle. I started dipping into money I'd set aside for emergencies, convincing myself that this was just temporary. By the third month of slow business, I couldn't keep up with rent anymore. I told my parents what was going on, hoping they'd understand. I even promised to pay back the missed months as soon as things picked up. They nodded but didn't say much, which, looking back, wasn't a great sign. As the weeks went on, the tension in the house grew thicker. My parents started bringing up the unpaid rent almost every day. It wasn't always direct, but sometimes it was little comments about how expensive everything is these days, or questions like, "When do you think you'll land a steady gig?" My dad, in particular, wasn't shy about reminding me that I'd made a commitment to contribute, and he expected me to honor it. Then there was my older brother Max, who lived nearby and visited often. He wasn't exactly subtle about his opinions. He'd drop lines like, "Maybe it's time to get a real job," or "Freelancing isn't exactly stable." Is it? I tried to brush it off, but it was hard not to take his words personally. Winter hit, and things got even worse. Heating costs became a frequent topic of discussion, and I could tell my parents were stressed about the rising bills. Every time I turned on the heat in my room, I felt a pang of guilt, like I was adding to their financial burden. The missed rent payments loomed over every interaction, and my once supportive family dynamic started to crumble. One night, my parents sat me down for what felt like a formal meeting. They told me I had 1 month to start paying rent again, or find somewhere else to live. I don't blame them. They weren't running a charity, and they'd made their expectations clear from the start. But hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. I scrambled to find a solution. I applied for part-time jobs at local stores, sent out more proposals for freelance work, and even considered taking on some online gigs that paid pennies. But rejection emails piled up, and the opportunities one did get were too small to make a real dent in what I owed. Things hit a breaking point at a family dinner. My brother casually suggested that my parents should kick me out, saying it was the only way I'd learn to stand on my own 2 feet. That led to a heated argument. I tried to explain that I wasn't slacking off, that I was doing everything I could to get back on track. But my dad sided with my brother, insisting that tough love was the only option. The eviction deadline loomed closer, and I grew desperate. I started selling personal belongings to scrape together some cash. Old gadgets, furniture, even some of my art supplies. All gone. It wasn't enough. My parents stood firm, and as the final day approached, I knew there was no point in pleading anymore. On the morning of the deadline, my dad knocked on my door and told me it was time to pack my things. I stuffed whatever I could into a single duffel bag, grabbed my laptop, and walked out into the bitter cold. The sting of the winter air matched the knot in my stomach. It was the lowest point I'd ever hit, and I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side of that front door. That's how I found myself here, starting over with nothing but a bag of clothes and a lot of regrets. Update 1. The first night after leaving my parents' house, I crashed on a friend's couch. He didn't hesitate when I called, saying I could stay for a couple of nights. I appreciated the offer, but it was clear he wasn't expecting this to be a long-term arrangement. The couch was small and lumpy, and his apartment always smelled faintly of burnt coffee, but it was better than freezing outside. Still, I couldn't shake the awkwardness of being there, like I was intruding on his space. By the third day, I knew I couldn't stay much longer. I started looking at room rentals in the city, but even the cheapest options were out of reach without steady income. Every listing required a deposit and the first month's rent upfront, the money I didn't have. It was a harsh reality check. I wasn't just broke, I was stuck. At first, my friends had been supportive. When I told them I'd been kicked out, messages poured in dash, "That's so unfair, man. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." But as days turned into weeks, those offers started to dry up. Calls went unanswered. Texts were left on read. People had their own lives to deal with, and I was becoming that friend, the one no one knew how to handle. Job applications became a daily ritual. I applied for anything I could find: part-time cashier positions, remote customer service jobs, freelance gigs. Each day ended the same way: a growing pile of rejection emails. Some companies didn't even bother responding. Felt like I was screaming into a void. The winter cold made everything worse. Walking to job interviews in freezing temperatures felt like a punishment, especially when I didn't have a proper winter coat. I'd shiver through the meetings, trying to act professional while my toes went numb. Public places like libraries or coffee shops became my go-to spots for warmth. But staying there for hours without buying anything made me feel like a freeloader. Desperate for work, I reached out to old clients, hoping they had projects for me. Most didn't reply. The ones who did were polite but said they didn't have anything available. It was like the universe had decided to shut every door at once. Meanwhile, my brother was living it up. He'd visit my parents and post pictures of cozy family dinners on social media. In one photo, everyone was sitting around the table with plates of steaming food, laughing like nothing had happened. Seeing those posts made me feel like an outsider in my own family. When I finally worked up the courage to call my parents, it didn't go well. My mom answered, and the conversation was brief. She told me they loved me but that I needed to figure this out on my own. The call ended with a dial tone before I could even respond. Food became a daily struggle. With the little money I had, I started skipping meals to make it last. A pack of instant noodles could stretch 2 days if I rationed it. There were nights when my stomach growled so loudly, I thought it might wake up the entire apartment building. I started picking up odd jobs from Craigslist: shoveling snow, assembling flat-pack furniture, delivering groceries for an app. The work was physically exhausting and paid just enough to cover bus fare and a cheap meal. It wasn't sustainable, but it was better than nothing. One of the delivery gigs led to an awkward encounter with an old high school friend, Lexi. I rang the doorbell, and when she opened the door, her face lit up with recognition. Then came the pity. She asked how I'd been, and I muttered something vague before handing over her groceries. She gave me a larger than usual tip, but it felt like charity. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I got sick. The constant exposure to the cold and skipping meals had finally caught up with me. It started with a cough but quickly turned into a fever. I dragged myself to a clinic and left with a prescription for antibiotics that I could barely afford. The pharmacist looked at me with concern when I pulled crumpled bills from my pocket to pay. A small break came when a former college roommate, Ben, heard about my situation. He called out of the blue and offered me his couch for a few nights. His place was cleaner and quieter, and for the first time in weeks, I got a full night's sleep. It didn't solve my problems, but it gave me a moment to breathe. Feeling desperate, I called my mom again, hoping she might reconsider. She didn't budge. Her voice was firm as she told me this was tough love and that I'd thank them someday. I hung up the phone, realizing I couldn't count on them for help. That night, sitting in the dark on my roommate's couch, something shifted. The pity party was over. No one was coming to save me, and wallowing in my situation wouldn't change a thing. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to give up. Update 2. 2 weeks of rejection emails and odd jobs finally gave way to a breakthrough. I landed a remote gig proofreading articles for a small content site. The pay wasn't great, barely enough to cover food and bus fare, but it was steady work, and that was more than I'd had in a while. It didn't solve all my problems, but at least I wasn't sitting idle anymore. Most of my shifts started early in the morning. I'd set up my laptop on whatever surface I could find, whether it was a friend's dining table or the counter at a coffee shop. The pay wasn't enough to afford a place of my own, so I was still bouncing around, relying on the kindness of whoever would let me crash for a night or two. It wasn't ideal, but it kept me out of the cold. The public library became my go-to spot during the day. It was warm, quiet, and had free Wi-Fi. I'd spend hours there, proofreading articles, applying for more jobs, and working on my portfolio. The library had this old wooden desk in the corner that I claimed as my own. The chair wobbled a bit, but I didn't care. It was a little corner of stability in an otherwise chaotic time. While scrolling through my contacts one afternoon, I spotted the name of a professor from college who'd always been supportive of my work. On a whim, I sent them an email, explaining my situation and asking if they had any advice. To my surprise, they replied quickly, offering to meet for coffee. During our meeting, they gave me tips on how to polish my resume and even recommended a few websites to find better freelance gigs. It wasn't a solution, but it felt like a step forward. Not long after, a coworker from my proofreading job mentioned they were renting out a small room in their apartment. It was cheap, but there was a catch. It was a shared space with only a thin curtain separating it from the rest of the living room. Privacy was practically non-existent, but it was a roof over my head, and I jumped at the chance. Moving in was quick since I didn't have much to my name: a duffel bag of clothes, my laptop, and a couple of personal items. One evening, I got a call from my mom. She asked if I'd learned my lesson yet, which felt more like a dig than a check-in. I didn't argue it wasn't worth it. Later that week, I found out from a mutual acquaintance that my brother had been telling the family I was too lazy to find real work. It was frustrating, but I was too drained to confront him about it. The weight of rejection and isolation started to take its toll. Even with the remote gig and the new living arrangement, it felt like I was stuck in the same endless cycle. That changed when a friend of a friend reached out, offering me a small design commission for a local business. It wasn't a huge job, but seeing my work being used again lit a spark. I delivered the project on time and they were thrilled. They even mentioned they might have more work in the future. Around the same time, an old high school friend messaged me out of the blue. We hadn't talked in years, but they'd heard about my situation through mutual friends. They invited me out for coffee and spent hours listening without judgment. They didn't offer solutions or pity but just support. And it made a bigger difference than they probably realized. I started tracking every penny I spent, stretching my budget as far as it would go. Meals became simpler. Bus routes were planned meticulously to avoid unnecessary trips. I resisted every urge to buy anything I didn't absolutely need. It was a humbling process, but it taught me how to prioritize like never before. After a few months of scraping by, I managed to save enough to send my parents a small payment toward the rent I owed them. It wasn't much, but I hoped it would be a gesture of good faith. My dad's response was curt. He told me to prove myself before they'd consider letting me come back. It stung, but I didn't argue. There was no point. I shifted my focus entirely to building my portfolio and applying for better gigs. Every spare moment was spent working on projects, even if they were just for practice. I knew that if I wanted to turn things around, I'd have to rebuild from the ground up. Slowly, things started to look up. The library desk became my unofficial office, and every completed project felt like a step closer to stability. By the time spring rolled around, I wasn't just surviving. I was planning. The tiny wins, the commissions, and even the cramped room with the curtain divider all felt like progress. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in months, I could see a path forward. It wasn't about proving anything to my family or anyone else anymore. It was about making sure I never ended up in this position again. Things started turning around when I got an email from a startup looking for a freelance graphic designer. They'd stumbled across my portfolio, which I had been working on religiously, and were impressed enough to offer me a remote job with consistent projects. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was fair, and more importantly, it was steady. I jumped at the chance, eager to finally have something that didn't feel like it could vanish overnight. The workload was manageable, and for the first time in months, I wasn't constantly checking my bank account in panic. I got into a routine. Mornings at the library or my shared space, afternoons knocking out design projects. Evenings fine-tuning my portfolio. Slowly, the worry about surviving started to fade. I could pay my rent on time, eat 3 meals a day, and even set a little money aside. After a few months, I had saved up enough to move out of the shared living room. It wasn't much, a tiny studio apartment with creaky floors and paper-thin walls, but it was mine. No more tiptoeing around roommates or staring at a curtain for privacy. I moved in with just my laptop, a mattress, and a secondhand table I found on Craigslist. It felt like I was reclaiming a piece of my independence. Around the same time, my brother reached out. He hadn't spoken to me much since I left our parents' house, but suddenly he was sending texts, asking how I was doing and suggesting we grab coffee. I didn't buy the sudden interest. It felt more like he had noticed I was doing okay and wanted to ride the wave. Still, I agreed to meet up. We kept it surface level, no mention of the past or his earlier criticisms. I could tell he was fishing for details about my work, but I didn't give him much. Meanwhile, I heard through a family friend that my parents were arguing about me. My mom thought they had been too harsh kicking me out, while my dad doubled down, saying it was the only way I'd learn. I didn't know whether to feel vindicated or just tired of the whole thing. Instead of dwelling on it, I focused on building what I called my revenge budget. I wanted to prove to everyone that I could make it on my own, and make it big. Then, an old freelance client came back into the picture. They had a major project and specifically asked for me. The pay was more than I'd ever made on a single job, and the work was exciting. I poured everything into it, and when the project launched, the response was overwhelming. A piece of the design went semi-viral on social media, and inquiries from other potential clients started flooding in. With the extra income, I doubled down on my savings plan. I set aside an emergency fund, paid off lingering debts, and even donated to a local charity that supports young people struggling to get on their feet. Quietly helping others felt like a way to repay the kindness I had received during my toughest times. One day, my mom called. She congratulated me on how well I was doing, but there was an undertone of justification in her words. She said they had only been hard on me because they knew I could handle it. I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the mixed feelings. I wanted to believe they meant well, but it was hard to forget how cold they had been when I needed them most. My brother's situation came to light not long after. During a casual conversation, he admitted he had been struggling financially too. He had a steady job but had racked up debt from lifestyle choices he couldn't afford. For the first time, he seemed less smug and more human. It didn't erase the past, but it gave me a new perspective on him. We weren't so different after all. The first time I visited my parents' house again, it felt strange. They invited me over for dinner, and I went more out of curiosity than anything else. My dad seemed quieter than usual, and my mom fussed over the meal like she was trying to make up for lost time. At one point during dinner, my dad said they might have been a bit too harsh but insisted it was necessary. Tough love. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was probably the closest I was going to get. As I left that night, I realized something had shifted. I didn't feel the same resentment I had carried for months. I wasn't entirely ready to forgive them, but I didn't feel the need to prove anything to them anymore either. My success, my stability, it was mine. And nothing they said or did could take that away. Felt like I had come full circle, but on my own terms. I wasn't the same person who had walked out of their house with a duffel bag in the middle of winter. I had built a life for myself one step at a time. And while the journey had been brutal, it had shaped me into someone I was finally proud of. Update 4. Work at the startup had been steady for months, and I was starting to hit my stride. My designs were getting noticed not just internally, but by clients as well. The team started assigning me bigger projects, and a few even hinted that I had a knack for innovative design. On top of that, my freelance gigs were picking up again. Word-of-mouth referrals and the visibility from my viral design brought in consistent side work. For the first time, I had 2 reliable income streams, and I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck anymore. With the extra money, I decided to upgrade my apartment. The new place wasn't flashy, but it was a definite step up from my cramped studio. It had a small balcony, proper heating, and an actual bedroom. Moving day was satisfying. Every box I unpacked felt like proof of how far I had come since being kicked out. Around this time, I started setting boundaries with my family. My brother's sudden interest in my life hadn't gone unnoticed, but his dismissive comments still slipped through. Whenever we talked, he'd make offhand remarks like, "Must be nice getting lucky with freelancing." Freelancing still isn't real work, though. I stopped engaging and kept my distance. I only responded when necessary. One day, I heard from a family friend that my parents were facing financial trouble. A pipe had burst in their basement, leading to costly repairs. On top of that, their roof needed urgent work after a recent storm. I hadn't spoken to them much lately, so the news caught me off guard. A few days later, my mom called. She started by asking about work and life, but eventually the conversation shifted. She mentioned how expensive the repairs were, hinting that they could use some help. I stayed polite but didn't commit to anything. The awkwardness hung in the air long after the call ended. Not long after, my brother reached out again. This time, he directly asked if I could pitch in to help our parents. His tone was different, not smug, but almost desperate. I reminded him of how he treated me when I was struggling, which led to an argument. He accused me of holding a grudge, while I pointed out that his judgments hadn't aged well. We didn't resolve anything. The call ended with more tension than when it started. I spent the next few days reflecting on what to do. On one hand, they were my family. On the other, I couldn't ignore how they had treated me when I needed them most. Ultimately, I decided to prioritize my own stability. I'd worked too hard to get back on my feet to risk it now. Around this time, a local news outlet contacted me. They were doing a feature on young entrepreneurs and had heard about my viral design. The interview went well, and when the piece was published, it brought a wave of recognition. I started getting inquiries from potential clients and even a few local businesses wanting to collaborate. My professional credibility skyrocketed almost overnight. An unexpected text came in a week later, from the same high school friend who had offered me support when I was at my lowest. They had seen the article and wanted to catch up. We met for coffee, and they reminded me of how far I'd come. They encouraged me to keep focusing on my well-being, even if it meant putting some distance between me and my family drama. It was the perspective I didn't realize I needed. Still, the family rift wasn't going anywhere. I agreed to visit my parents for a rare family dinner, partly out of obligation and partly out of curiosity. The evening was tense. My dad made a comment about how I had abandoned them when they needed help, despite the fact that they had kicked me out. My brother chimed in, calling me selfish for not stepping up now that I was doing well. I bit my tongue and focused on getting through the meal. The final straw came when my brother let slip that he was jealous of how well I was doing. He admitted he was struggling financially too, though he downplayed it as temporary. It wasn't an apology, but it explained some of his attitude. Still, I left that night feeling more certain than ever that I couldn't let family guilt dictate my choices. Back at home, I threw myself into my work. I had managed to pay off all my personal debts and had built a substantial emergency fund. I was finally in a position where I didn't have to worry about unexpected expenses or missed opportunities. The financial independence felt like a shield, protecting me from the chaos that had once controlled my life. By the end of the month, I had made a decision. My family's issues weren't mine to solve, and I couldn't let their expectations pull me backward. I resolved to stay focused on my own goals, keeping them at arm's length while I continued building the life I had fought so hard to create.